Imagine this. The world is at war. It's September 1939, and Germany, led by Adolf Hitler, has just set the world on fire by invading Poland. Within days, England and France declare war on Germany, and what follows is a devastating conflict between mighty nations. Germany swiftly takes control, crushing its enemies one by one. The Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg all fall under Nazi control. France, the great power, crumbles, and Paris is seized in what seems like a blink of an eye. The British are humiliated as their cities are bombed relentlessly, day after day. London, a city that had never seen such destruction, burns under the weight of the German shells. The mighty England is on its knees, reeling from this onslaught. Germany isn't stopping. Denmark falls within hours. Norway soon after. It's a horrifying sight. Within mere months, Germany has occupied nearly half of Western Europe. The world watches, stunned, as it seems no one can stand against Hitler's war machine. The balance of power is shifting rapidly, with France and England, once the titans of the global stage, now teetering on the brink of collapse. But then, something strange happens. Just when it seems like Germany is unstoppable, Hitler makes a decision that baffles historians to this day. On June 22nd, 1941, less than 2 years after the start of World War II, Adolf Hitler launches Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. This decision was tantamount to suicide. Operation Barbarossa would become one of the greatest military blunders in history. Hitler, who had so carefully orchestrated victory after victory in Western Europe, suddenly puts everything on the line by opening a new front in the vast and frigid lands of the Soviet Union. It's a decision that many describe as an epic strategic mistake. The plan was for a quick victory, with German forces reaching Moscow within a matter of weeks. But what happened was the opposite. 4 years later, Soviet forces would capture Berlin, bringing the Nazi regime to its knees. But was it really a mistake? Why, at the height of his power, did Hitler choose to invade the Soviet Union? A move that would ultimately lead to his downfall. Today, we are going to dive deep into this historical puzzle and explore this historical puzzle. Why did Hitler drown himself in the Soviet Union quagmire? To understand the magnitude of Hitler's decision, we need to consider the formidable power of the Soviet Union at the time. The Soviet Union wasn't just another enemy. It was a terrifying behemoth with a military force that could make any adversary think twice. First, let's talk about tanks. The Soviet Union had an astonishing 23,000 tanks. Yes, you heard that right, 23,000. To put that into perspective, modern armies today don't even come close to having that many tanks. Germany, on the other hand, had about 25,000 tanks. But here's the catch. Germany was already stretched thin, fighting on multiple fronts against France and England. Many of their tanks were already being consumed in these battles. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union's tanks were ready, waiting, and far from being worn out. And it wasn't just tanks. The Soviet Union also boasted a formidable air force, with 19,500 aircraft. In contrast, Germany had around 18,700 planes. This slight numerical superiority in the Soviet Union Air Force was crucial, especially considering that Germany was already busy dealing with the Western Front. And then there were the soldiers. The Soviet Union had millions of soldiers ready for battle. We're talking about a standing army of over 3 million troops, with the capacity to mobilize even more if needed. It's mind-boggling to think that Hitler would decide to confront a country with such vast military capabilities. It's almost as if he was knowingly walking into a lion's den. Second, Let's not forget that Germany was already in the middle of a brutal and unresolved war with France and England. The southern half of France was still unoccupied, and a shadow government had formed, led by Charles de Gaulle, with the goal of regaining control and liberating France from German occupation. Meanwhile, the British forces, though battered, were far from defeated. The entire conflict with England had been an air war so far, with the full might of the British Army yet to be unleashed on the ground. Third, there's America. At this point, the United States hadn't yet entered the war, but the possibility of American intervention loomed large. Even if the US didn't send troops immediately, it could still provide the Allies with crucial logistical and economic support, supplies, weapons, money. And if American soldiers did eventually join the fight, it would spell disaster for the Germans. Fourth, we must remember that before World War II began, Hitler had actually made a pact with the Soviet Union, a non-aggression treaty that was supposed to keep both nations from attacking each other. This agreement, signed on August 23, 1939, just a week before the war officially began, is known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, named after the German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop and the Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov. This pact was more than just a promise of peace. It was a strategic division of influence. The agreement essentially split Eastern Europe between Germany and the Soviet Union. Poland was divided into zones of occupation, with Germany taking the western parts and the Soviet Union claiming the eastern regions. They also carved up other parts of Eastern Europe. Germany was given the right to enter Lithuania, while the Soviet Union had free reign over Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and eastern Poland. Even during the early stages of the war, when the rest of Europe was embroiled in conflict, this pact held strong. In fact, Germany and the Soviet Union even entered into a trade agreement, where Germany supplied the Soviet Union with military equipment in exchange for oil and food. This was crucial for Germany, which was under an economic blockade by Britain, struggling to receive supplies from other nations. So why, with such a beneficial agreement in place, would Hitler choose to break it? Why risk everything by turning against an ally that was supplying him with vital resources? Fifth, Hitler's advisors had warned him about the consequences of invading these territories. They pointed out that occupying the Baltic states and Ukraine, regions that lay between Germany and the Soviet Union, would be more of an economic burden than a benefit. These were not wealthy areas. They were poor, with populations that could become a heavy economic weight for Germany to bear. Yet, despite this advice, Hitler was determined. Sixth, and perhaps the most perplexing of all, is the question, what more did Hitler want? His successes by 1941 were already staggering. He had conquered half of Europe and achieved military victories that would have satisfied any other leader. But for Hitler, it wasn't enough. His greed pushed him to aim for even greater conquest, the Soviet Union, despite the enormous risks. A move so reckless that it threatened everything he had gained in the past 2 years. Seventh, the most baffling aspect of Hitler's decision. History had already provided a clear lesson. Invading the Soviet Union was an unsafe, dangerous gamble. The last great conqueror to try it was Napoleon in 1812, and we all know how that ended. Napoleon's campaign in Russia was a disaster. His once mighty army was decimated, his empire began to crumble, and he eventually lost everything. Hitler, driven by the same greed for global empire, was now walking down a path that history had shown would lead only to ruin. So, as we piece together these strange and complex factors, we are left with a question that still puzzles historians today. Why did Hitler, at the height of his power, choose to make the same catastrophic mistake that had brought down an empire before him? All these factors contribute to making Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union one of the most enigmatic and perplexing events in modern history. But to truly understand why he made this choice, we need to examine the deep-seated beliefs and ideologies that drove him. First and foremost, Hitler harbored a deep and long-standing hostility toward the Soviet Union, a hatred that dated back to his earliest days in politics. Even in 1925, when he penned his famous book, Mein Kampf, 14 years before the outbreak of World War II, Hitler made it clear that he viewed the Soviet Union as a mortal enemy. His enmity wasn't just political, it was ideological. Hitler despised communism and saw it as a grave threat to not only Germany, but to the entire world. This animosity towards the Soviet Union was part of Hitler's intellectual foundation, long before the Nazi Party even seized power in 1933. The second explanation lies in Hitler's profoundly racist worldview, a view that was deeply ingrained in the Nazi ideology and shared by many in Germany at the time. The Germans, under Hitler's leadership, considered themselves the pinnacle of humanity, the so-called Aryan race, which they believed to be superior to all other peoples. This wasn't just empty rhetoric or internalized belief, it was a publicly declared stance, central to Nazi ideology. Hitler openly expressed these views in his speeches, writings, and policies. Hitler's view of the Soviet Union was especially contemptuous. He saw the Slavic peoples, particularly the Russians, as subhuman, a term he used to describe those he deemed racially inferior. This wasn't a hidden belief, it was an openly stated conviction. Hitler believed these so-called subhumans were unworthy of life, and that the vast territories they inhabited were better suited for German expansion. This racist ideology wasn't just about Slavic Russians, it also extended to Jews, whom Hitler saw as the ultimate enemies of Germany. He believed that the Soviet Union was led by Jewish Bolsheviks, further fueling his hatred and justifying his belief in the necessity of their extermination. So, when we look at Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union through the lens of his ideology, the mystery begins to unravel. This wasn't just a strategic military decision, it was a calculated move, driven by a deeply racist and expansionist agenda, an agenda that ultimately led to his downfall. The third factor driving Hitler's decision was his concept of Lebensraum, or living space. Hitler believed that in order to build a global German empire, Germany needed much more than just its existing territory and resources. The land, population, and wealth of Germany alone were insufficient to sustain a vast empire. To achieve his grand vision, Hitler set his sights on the immense and resource-rich lands of the Soviet Union. Hitler was convinced that occupying countries like France, Belgium, and Holland wouldn't be enough to establish the global empire he dreamt of. For that, he needed the Soviet Union, a land of vast natural resources. The Soviet Union had abundant minerals, essential agricultural lands, and, most importantly, oil reserves in places like Baku, Azerbaijan. Remember, this was a time before oil had been discovered in abundance in other parts of the world, making these resources even more valuable. Ukraine, with its rich agricultural produce, was especially attractive to Germany. Hitler wanted these crops to feed his empire. Beyond that, he sought the labor force, workers for his factories, farmers for his fields. In Hitler's mind, these territories would provide the essential living space, the Lebensraum, that would fuel the growth of his empire and secure its dominance for generations. Fourth, we must consider the arrogance of power and the intoxicating effect of Hitler's rapid and overwhelming victories. Denmark fell to Hitler in mere hours, less than a day. It took him just a few days to conquer the Netherlands and Belgium. Within a month and a half of France, including Paris, was under Nazi control. These repeated successes emboldened Hitler, blinding him to the true strength of the powers around him. Even Britain, once considered invincible, seemed to tremble before him, reinforcing his belief in his own invincibility. The fifth reason for Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union lies in Germany's historical aspirations for Eastern expansion. This wasn't a new idea. German history is filled with leaders who dreamt of expanding eastward, towards the lands of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. The western direction, on the other hand, was more complex and difficult. The nations to the west were ancient, with deeply rooted cultures and ideologies, making them harder to conquer and assimilate. This is why Hitler named his invasion of the Soviet Union Operation Barbarossa, in honor of Frederick Barbarossa, a medieval German emperor who ruled the Holy Roman Empire and led the Third Crusade. Frederick Barbarossa was a symbol of German Eastern ambitions, and by naming the operation after him, Hitler was not just launching a military campaign, he was invoking a powerful historical legacy. The idea of Eastern expansion was deeply ingrained in German history, and for Hitler, it was the key to establishing a global empire. The sixth factor in Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union was the state of the Soviet military itself. By the time Hitler launched his invasion, the Soviet army was in a state of tremendous turmoil. This was largely due to Joseph Stalin's brutal purges in the 1930s, just a few years before World War II. Stalin, known for his ruthlessness, systematically eliminated anyone he perceived as a threat within the military. Stalin's purges were devastating. He executed more than 3,000 of his own military officers, including 15 out of the 16 top army commanders. Imagine an entire command structure decimated. Stalin replaced these experienced leaders with those loyal to him, often less experienced or competent. This left the Soviet army severely weakened and in disarray. Hitler saw this as an opportunity. He believed that if he waited any longer, the Soviet military might recover and he would lose his chance to strike while they were vulnerable. Seventh, Hitler's confidence was further bolstered by the Soviet Union's poor performance in the Winter War against Finland. Despite being a small country, Finland managed to hold off the Soviet army for an extended period, exposing the weaknesses in Soviet military capabilities. Hitler saw this as proof that the Soviet army was not as formidable as it seemed. If the Soviet forces struggled against Finland, how could they possibly stand up to the might of the German Wehrmacht? Moreover, the alliance between Germany and the Soviet Union had allowed the Soviets to enter and occupy Finland, Estonia, and Latvia. But the Soviet Union's inability to decisively control these regions only strengthened Hitler's belief that the Red Army was weak and underprepared for a larger conflict. Eighth, Hitler also observed the strained relationship between Stalin's Communist Party and the Russian people. He believed that the Russian population was disillusioned with Stalin's regime and would not support the Soviet military in a war against Germany. Hitler expected that when the Germans invaded, the Russian people would either remain passive or, in some cases, even welcome the Germans as liberators. Ninth, Hitler was acting on intelligence reports that suggested the Soviet threat was looming over Eastern Europe. He feared that the Soviet Union might be planning to invade Eastern Europe and spread communism, eventually targeting Germany itself. To Hitler, this invasion was a preemptive strike, a way to stop the Soviets before they could launch their own attack. And finally, the 10th factor, timing. Hitler believed that his invasion would catch Stalin completely off guard. There were two key reasons for this. First, Hitler was already engaged on multiple fronts, fighting against England and France. Stalin didn't expect that Hitler would open yet another front by attacking the Soviet Union. Second, there was the Non-Aggression Pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Stalin trusted this agreement and didn't expect Hitler to betray him by launching a direct attack. 4 years later, it was the Soviet forces that stood victorious in Berlin, the heart of the Nazi regime. The very empire Hitler had sought to expand was now in ruins. His dream of global domination shattered by the very people he sought to destroy. In the end, it was Hitler's hubris, his underestimation of his enemies, and his blind faith in his own ideology that led to his downfall. As we look back on this dark chapter of history, we are reminded of the price that was paid and the lessons that must never be forgotten. Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union may forever remain a mystery in some respects, but one thing is clear. It was a decision that sealed the fate of Nazi Germany and altered the world forever. Thank you for joining us today on Historical Corridors. If you found this exploration of one of history's greatest enigmas intriguing, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Together, let's uncover the stories that shaped our world.